We're going to continue this morning with two panels. The first is a roundtable on Czech foreign policy between 2007 and 2009. We have 6 papers on very challenging subjects. This means some very strict timekeeping, so I'm going to keep things to 10 minutes per speaker, with then a substantial amount of time for discussion. I'll introduce each speaker by name and paper, but remind everyone, of course, that biographies are supplied. So with no further ado, I will turn to Vladimír Handl on my right-hand side, who will speak on Europeanization of Czech German policy and its limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will try to sum up in 10 minutes what we have found while analyzing Czech policy vis-à-vis Germany 2007, 8, and 9. I start with a brief reflection of the situation late 2006 when we started our research and our analysis. Then I go into the agenda of the relations during the period of 2007 to 9, and then sum up with some attempted conclusions and sort of lesson drawing from the experience. First of all, the situation of the Czech policy vis-à-vis Germany late 2006 was characterized by a very high density and intensity of relationship with Germany. The relations were very stable as far as the general practical agenda of cooperation on all levels are concerned. I mean the national level, the regional level, and also in the cross-border region on the local level. The existential interests of Czech Republic were not at stake. Czechs and Germans are allies, so they guarantee each other sovereignty, security, borders, etc. This issue was not at stake at all, and of course it eased the relations very importantly. The historical past was not on the agenda of political relations either at that point. 10 years on from the signature of this Czech-German declaration of 1997, the issues arising from the past, demands and challenges in this concern were not anymore on political agenda. Relations arrived rather at the issues of moral responsibility, moral reflections of the past in the society, and this defined the relations in this area for the next 3 years. There were, however, also more problematic issues, which I would describe as, first of all, a lack of closeness in a number of areas. This lack of closeness on strategic foreign policy issues like the European Union and security issues was linked with the historical normalization of the relations, which I mentioned, and with also this accession to the EU and NATO, which as if consumed the disciplining effect on the Czech political scene. With this EU and NATO accession, the Czech political parties started to voice their preferences, their ideological political preferences. The internal differentiation of the Czech political class became more apparent, and it also impacted on the relations, mainly the constitutional development of the European Union and the attitude to the radar project or anti-ballistic missile project of the USA played a role in this, while the Civic Democratic Party took a very different approach than the most political parties on the German side. Secondly, also we witnessed a development on the institutional side of the relationship. The new institutional setup of Czech foreign policy, the establishment of the Deputy Prime Minister's Office for European Affairs, of course, made the coordination of policies more problematic at the start. We witnessed a growing distance between the government and the president on a number of issues, which obviously also impacted on the Czech-German relationship. And then the decentralization of relations and engagement of a multitude of policy actors on all levels of policy making was linked with a lack of coordination of Czech policy towards Germany. So what we witnessed during the 3 years of time, my second point, is very positive dynamic of relationship, but still a lack of coherence in number of points. The most positive part of the story is obviously the European Union and the Europeanization of the relationship. As I said, the Czech policy was rather polarized since the Czech EU accession, but this polarization gradually restructured around the Lisbon Treaty during the time of 2007 to 2009. Like in Germany, basically, a broad non-partisan consensus has supported Lisbon at the end, or at least during 2009. And this dichotomy, which we've witnessed 2006 between supporters of the Lisbon Treaty or reform process of European Union and opponents, this dichotomy moved rather into the relationship between the government, in broad terms, and the president. The two presidencies were very important for this in this development: the German presidency 2007 and the Czech presidency 2009. And in many ways, I think we can say that the German presidency 2007 and the pragmatic agreement between Prime Minister Topolánek and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel on the issues of reform of the European Union and of the Reform Treaty and then later on Lisbon Treaty represent a kind of watershed in the Czech-German relations in the context of the European Union. From this time on, we really can witness a very cooperative, constructive relationship, which has, of course, included a number of issues where the two sides take different approaches, but they always try to work out a cooperative solution, compromise solution. The best manifestation has been definitely the Czech presidency. 2009, Germany turned out to be the most important, most active, most supportive partner for the Czech government, for all the Czech governmental institutions. Without the German support, the Czech presidency would have been much less successful. And we can, of course, discuss this more detailed later on, but I think this is really a watershed. The position of the President Klaus was different. He didn't join the, I would say, Lisbon compromise of in Czech-German relationship. He obstructed the ratification of the process to the last, so he really distanced himself from this, I would say, very positive dynamic of Czech-German relations in the European context. Military issues or military security was a bit different from our point of view. There has not been this kind of driving force and joint agenda. But we also witnessed important examples of new levels of cooperation. The Czech troops for the first time served under German command in Kunduz, and we also prepare now for European battle group, Czech and German soldiers together with Austrian and other troops. So we have this positive development here too. However, I don't think the military security area is one of the most important areas in the Czech-German relationship. It is rather on the secondary level. Then looking into how these two countries dealt with the issues or with the agenda of the past, I would say that in the last 3 years the Czech policy showed great deal of understanding or increasing understanding for the issues on the moral level. As I mentioned, the two sides agreed on prolongation of the existence of the two institutions which run the relations or which smooth the relations in this area, the Fund for the Future and also the dialogue, Czech-German dialogue forum. And I think this institutionalization has proved very successful. We have had other areas of cooperation of very great intensity: the internal security, the Czech accession to the Schengen area, the economic relations, where Germany has proved to be still the most important partner. However, the share of German trade in Czech trade has been decreasing with the Czech accession, so the Europeanization means more diversity in Czech relations with Europe. Also, the energy issues have been discussed greatly and to some extent also ideologized during just before the new sort of cooperation and accord between Czech and German governments on the European Union. I think we have now been in a more relaxed atmosphere as far as the energy issues are concerned, and we arrived at a more cooperative or more coherent sort of approach on both sides. Last example of a positive development perhaps would be the environment issues, where the Czech and German ministries really engaged into a very intensive relationship. Now, my last point is where are we now? And I would say we witnessed really a historization of the attitude to the past. The issues with dealing with the past really became an agenda for a public debate, for historical debate, not for the political negotiations. We have witnessed also a great deal of decentralization and depoliticization of relations on all levels. Decentralization in a top-down process, where all the governmental institutions started very intensive horizontal relations with their German partners in direct terms, and also we have witnessed the same kind of decentralization in a bottom-up process with a local and regional level establishing stable and intensive relationship. So the Europeanization, I think, has been a success. It has its limits, but basically I think what we've seen in the last 3 years is unprecedented level of togetherness and cooperation, which doesn't mean lack of differences, but it is a very cooperative and dynamic relationship, which I think we have to welcome. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vladimír. We'll now turn to Vít Beneš, second on my right, to address the paper Between Prague and Brussels, the European Dimension of Czech Foreign Policy. And again, 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'll try to keep my presentation short. You definitely know that the European agenda is very rich. We can talk for hours about the Lisbon Treaty, about the Czech EU presidency, etc., etc. I would like to highlight a few rather general comments and points about Czech European policy in the first part of my presentation, and my second part of the presentation focuses on few concrete issues on the Lisbon Treaty, on the presidency, and on the agenda, in particular policies. So I will start with the general overlook of both the internal discussions about Europe in the Czech Republic and about the official policy of the Czech Republic, of the government of the Czech Republic. As you all know, the discussion within the Czech Republic is very tough regarding the institutional structure of the European Union. We have very conflicting views. We have the supporters of a rather intergovernmental Europe from the ODS. We have supporters of rather transnational institutional setup from the Greens, from the Christian Democrats, and also Social Democrats. What we have seen during the past 3 years were several important shifts in this regard. At first, we witnessed a kind of pragmatization on the part of ODS or the Civic Democrats. I will talk about it later on. I attribute it to their direct experience with the European affairs during the presidency. The pragmatization means that they knew that the European Union is more about finding consensus which in the next step needs to be somehow upheld in the internal discussion. So the scene remains divided, but the divisions shifted. We have a president which keeps his Eurosceptical position, and we have a more pragmatic position of the ODS. Second point I would like to highlight, the Czech Republic, and right now I'm talking rather about the official position, sees the European Union and the European integration as a kind of clash of national interests, some kind of power game. In this power game, the Czech Republic faces the big powers. We, from our history, has certain traumas regarding the big powers' behavior, and this somehow translates into our current European policy. So the Czech Republic is very sensitive about possibly losing its power. Therefore, in the discussions about the internal structure, the Czech Republic very much focused on this issue, whether we keep our relative power in the decision-making processes. But at the same time, the Czech Republic, or at least the official governmental position, very much focus on keeping the European integration intergovernmental. When we recall the negotiations of the Lisbon Treaty, the Czech Republic played a role of some kind of brakeman. We were trying to push brakes and somehow limit the deepening of the integration, in the sense that we somehow pushed against the adoption of majority voting in the European Council. This is kind of paradoxical. If we, for example, have a look at the Benelux countries, these countries develop different strategies in their power game against the big beasts. They somehow supported the transnational institution as some kind of balance against the power of the big beast. The Czech Republic, on the contrary, developed different strategy, keeping the European Union as much intergovernmentalist as possible. So this is the next second point. My next point relates to the question whether there were some kind of learning curves on the part of Czech politicians. I definitely see some learning curves. The first learning curve was definitely the EU presidency. Up until the presidency, the European affairs were limited to a group of experts from this ministry, from the office of the government, and the Czech politicians somehow kept talking about European integration, kept criticizing the European integration, and the presidency was some kind of the first opportunity for them to immerse their hands into the daily affairs of the European Union. So the learning curve, I would say that especially the Eurosceptics or Euro-realists somehow found out that European Union is not governed by some bureaucrats or Eurocrats, but that the European Union is a group of 27 states run by the representatives of the states in the European Council. At the same time, I would like to stress that even though we can find some learning curve on the part of Czech political elite who were suddenly forced to deal with the European Union on a daily basis, there is no, I would say, there is no learning curve on the part of the public as such. The public and the public discourse still perceives the Brussels as some kind of distant power center, which sometimes is is helpful for us because they send us money. Sometimes this distant power center is to be criticized because it somehow influences us in some negative way. Next point, I would like to stress some general point about the Czech attitude towards the European Union. Even though we are very much split regarding the internal setup of the European Union, there is some kind of consensus, I would say consensus regarding the external issues. Of course, there are divisions regarding the CFSP and etc., but there is some deeper consensus that we need kind of competitive and strong Europe. This topic has been raised both by the Social Democrats and the Civic Democrats, and if we have a look at the policy of Topolánek's government during the presidency itself, he in practice pushed for a more self-confident Europe in global and regional affairs. He pushed for kind of self-confident position towards Russia. So in the end, we may say that in this external dimension, the government comprised of Eurosceptics or Eurorealists. In fact, these people were Europeanists in spite of themselves. They supported the idea of a strong and competitive Europe, of course, through different means than Social Democrats would. And at the same time, they promoted the deepening of European integration. They promoted the establishment of common energy policy. So this is the second learning curve of Czech politicians. During the negotiations of the Lisbon Treaty, they acted like brakemen. They acted like brakemen regarding the decision-making process when they advocated the veto of national states in the decision-making process. And the second learning curve was that during the Lisbon Treaty, they were against the deepening of the integration, but during the presidency itself, they in fact pushed for the establishment of new policy. So we have to stop here. I have few more comments regarding the Lisbon Treaty, but we will leave it for the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you indeed, Vít. And of course, we'll be coming back to our panelists in the discussion. I'm very grateful that everybody is keeping so closely to the time on such substantial topics. On my left now, Filip Tesař, who will be speaking on biased politicians, cautious entrepreneurs, uninformed public, asking, were the Balkans close to us? Thank you.
The Balkans are close to us. One can often hear such statement when Czech politicians talk with their Balkan counterparts. But is it true, false, or partly true? The main basis for political partnership is often an economic interest. Our chief trade partners in the Balkans many years ago are Romania and Bulgaria. Trade growth is in both cases apparently in connection to the EU membership. Relatively high levels of Czech export of goods and services and direct investment were not, however, accompanied by closer political cooperation with both countries. Of course, Czech politicians travel relatively frequently there, but their activity lacks an effort to build a partnership based on common goals. Such a policy began and ended with clear Czech support for accession of Bulgaria and Romania. The only light point in this respect in the Czech policy towards the Balkans since then is clear support for the Republic of Macedonia's accession to the NATO despite the disagreement of the majority of alliance members. But it is rather in connection with the pro-US stance of the right wing of the Czech political stage than with the region itself. Trade with other Balkan countries is insignificant when compared with Romania and Bulgaria. Czech entrepreneurs are rather cautious. Instability and political problems frighten them. It seems they perceived clear prospects for the EU accession, but also NATO membership as an indication of stability. They wait for politicians and pay attention to the regions branded as safe by politicians. But there is still insufficient communication between politics and business. Despite professional services afforded by state agencies like Czech Trade and Czech Centers, as well as by the Czech diplomacy and Czech Foreign Ministry, it looks businessmen lacked political information, visions on and explanations of the situation from the government. This is clear in the case of Serbia, which is a country to which Czechs have probably the broadest range of NGO ties. The range includes ties between universities, self-governmental bodies, regions, and various other non-governmental associations, including a business association. Nevertheless, trade with Serbia is on low level, and it gradually rises only from the Serbian side. Despite efforts of Czech Trade and Ministry of Industry and Trade since 2007, it remained stable on the Czech side, most likely because the internal political turbulences in Serbia connected to elections in 2007 and then with the Kosovo's independence and Serbia's cooperation with the International Crime Tribunal for war crimes. In connection with these events, the European prospect for Serbia was questioned. Kosovo's independence was the only event which awakened an interest of the Czech politicians in the Balkans. More than half of political stage opposed the independence and its Czech recognition. Many of politicians signed petitions against it, attended public demonstrations, argued on their blogs that it was not possible, etc. Nevertheless, this pro-Serbian posture was half-hearted, as virtually all excitement vanished after the recognition. Majority of Czech politicians displayed probably not an attitude to the problem, but rather bias in favor of the good guys, Serbs, which are Slavic, Christian, brave, and for a part also anti-American and pro-Russian, and as well as many prejudices to Albanians, the bad guys, drug dealers, Muslims, savages, and moreover, of course, pro-American guys. Croatia is probably the closest to the Czech public of all Balkan countries in general. For instance, hundreds of thousands of Czechs travel every year to Croatia. It's more than to all Balkan countries together. In regard of the EU accession, 3/4 of Czech citizens support Croatia's accession, according to the polls, while support for other Balkan countries ranged from 1/4 to 1/2. Croatia is mostly Catholic land, Slavic land, historically part of the Habsburg Union. It has virtually no Muslims, and Islam means East, Orient, otherness. And it is the richest of all Balkan countries, except of Greece, of course. So the apparent closeness is only superficial. Croatia is not as close as it is similar to us and pretty. Czech trade with Croatia and investment there remained low in the long term. NGO ties are poor, which indicates low interest of the Czech public in the land except of its beaches. Czech public is not well informed about the Balkans. Little wonder, the list of Balkan issues about which Czech media informed between 2007 and 2009 sporadically, superficially or never is long. Elections in Serbia, Kosovo's internal situation, negotiation about its final status, independence and recognition of it, Macedonia's conflict with Greece, Croatia's conflict with Slovenia, process of Croatia's accession talks, reforms in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Albania, for instance, is missing in the news almost completely. The only media trying to cover the region systematically is the Czech radio. Such state of information is not surprising, given that politicians pay to the region only small attention, and this is not surprising, given that politicians are poor informed about it. And it seems they are poor informed because they don't demand information, so still the Balkans are not real close to them. It is symptomatic that written scholarly production, books or articles on the Balkans in Czechia between 2007 and 2009, and also before, deals mainly with historical or linguistic issues. No one scholarly work dealing with, for example, with economical ties with the Balkans. So our relations to the Balkans are still based on the past. There is, for example, a tradition of some relations with Serbia and Serbians, but not with Kosovo or Albanians. And our foreign policy deals to the great extent with an image of the Balkans and not with the region itself. The Balkans is real close to us only in a few points. Romania especially, and Bulgaria as well, are important for us economically. Serbia is close to the hearts of many Czech politicians. Croatia is attractive for many ordinary Czechs. No one of these countries is really close to us, to the Czech Republic. No one has significant place in the Czech foreign policy. Prospects for closer ties with some Balkan countries still exist, but without the political will, the expectations cannot be fulfilled. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Filip. We'll now turn, following the program as printed, to Jan Hřích at the end of the table, speaking on economic diplomacy within the context of the changing economic environment. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Jan Hřích, and among other, I was for 3 years responsible for preparing contributions to the yearbook about economic diplomacy, and moreover, yes, in the 1990s, I was relatively near of some decisions, yes, and development in the time of creation of Czech system of external relations support. Probably as we all in this room remember, the Czech economic transformation at the beginning of 1990s was based on rather strictly and tightly understood principles of neoliberal economics and economic policy. Within this framework, there was only very limited, if some, room for systematic governmental support of exports and other forms of external economic relations. But principles are one thing, and reality, especially reality of small economy and very open economy, which depends very strongly on export. For instance, export has a share about 80% on the gross domestic product formation of the Czech Republic is other thing, yes. And later came the crisis of external balance of the Czech Republic, which led in the spring of 1997 even to monetary crisis, yes. And this began to extend step by step a room for some very pragmatic measures and steps towards creating a standard system of support of foreign external economic relations, yes. Perhaps the most important steps from the time of 1990s is foundation of two governmental agencies, Czech Trade, which is trade promotion agency, and Czech Invest, which is agency which should support influx of foreign direct investments. Yes, the existing system of trade, or rather export promotion, which is perhaps the most important part of the system of external relations support, is based on three kinds of measure, the so-called triangle of export promotion. It is refinancing of export by providing export credits, insurance of export operations risk on the non-commercial basis, yes, with the participation of public funds, and the third big group is so-called informational support of export, which is in the newspeak of WTO called as trade facilitation. Yes, in the Czech there is two-level system of steering of external economic relations support. Yes, the upper institutions, yes, and this whole system is under political steering and responsibility of two ministries, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Industry and Trade. Yes, to this topic we can say that Foreign Office administrates this sphere as a part of the whole Czech foreign policy, and administrates, of course, Czech embassies, on which are active departments for economic and trade. Yes, the economic ministry, Ministry of Industry and Trade, manages this system in the first line, I would say, from professional point of view, and set the professional agenda of the whole system. Yes, this agenda set on this political level is implemented mainly by the governmental agencies, especially Czech Trade and Czech Invest, but an important role played here economic departments of embassies, which operate direct in concrete territories. Yes, we can say that our system of promotion of external relations has some features of its gradual formation, and thus is rather complex. But what is the main thing, on the other hand, it showed its efficiency, especially during last months of the great global economic crisis. Yes. In February of 2009, in February of last year, was accepted so-called National Anti-Crisis Plan, yes, by the former right-wing government. Yes, and within this plan, a very important role should play the system of export promotion, yes. The measures within this plan were focused in the first line on so-called financial support of export. And within this intention was in the first line enhance the financial capacity of the two semi-state financial companies. There are EGAP, Export Guarantee and Insurance Company, and Czech Export Bank, which, yes, are responsible for financial part of export promotion. It means refinancing of export credits and insurance on a non-commercial basis. Yes, and what is a great achievement of this aim, yes, and I see it especially as a person that remember the situation in the middle and after the middle of 1990s, when the crisis of external balance led to very big problems of the whole economy, and later to financial crisis and a big devaluation of Czech currency. Yes, what is a big achievement? Yes, and absolutely a sign of absolutely other situation in this decade is that during the whole last year, 2009, remained the trade balance in surplus, which helped to keep the balance of payment in a sustainable state and thus helped to moderate impacts of crisis on the Czech economy. Yes, and we can say without this sound development of external balance would be the impacts of crisis for the whole Czech economy and for Czech people probably much more severe. Yes, it is one great achievement of our system of trade promotion. Yes, I would like to say a few words about another topic of system of external relations, external economic relations support, namely about so-called investment incentives. It means system of support of foreign direct yes, this system of this instrument was introduced about 10 years ago, about 2000, and at that time it played very important positive role, and in my opinion it was very principal element of a very impressive economic development, economic achievements of the Czech economy in that decade. Yes, without these standard incentives, the Czech economy would be hardly enough competitive for massive FDI influx, and our economic success was in big measure based on foreign direct investments. But just now is the situation a bit different, yes, and we don't need to support any foreign direct investment by spending public funds, and the Czech Republic uses foreign direct investments in the first line as instrument for technological transfers. Yes, and the role of, yes, and in this sense changed the role of Czech Invest, which is the oldest Czech implementation agency based in 1992. Yes, it is the second topic. We can summarize that on the one hand, the Czech system of support of external economic relations is rather complex, but what is the main thing, it is flexible enough to react on the changing external and both external and internal environment, and is able to react on the situation. Thank you.
Superb, thank you very much, Jan. We will now turn to the other end of our stretch of panelists to introduce Vít Střítecký, who will be speaking on Czech security policy, internal grievances, and external acceptability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your kind invitation to this roundtable. I principally have two agendas that I'd like to raise here. First of all, when analyzing the recent Czech security foreign or Czech security policy, I've discovered some sort of long-term patterns or long-term processes that I find very interesting from a theoretical perspective, and maybe I'd like to outline a couple of theoretical points that might be relevant for them, and I'd like to stress here that I'll be talking almost strictly theoretically and not that much normatively in this perspective. And then if I still have time, or because I'm not actually entirely sure, I'd like to raise a few empirical issues, maybe to balance my rather theoretical speech. And then, and in these cases, I'll be actually strictly normative and not that much theoretical at all. We started this symposium, or the symposium started on Monday with a discussion with the Czech politicians dealing with foreign policies in their respective countries. And one of the issues that was raised in the debate was some sort of lack of interest of the political countries when it comes to foreign policy. And we might conceptualize this issue as a kind of policy of non-interest. And it has a couple of points that might be actually raised when we talk about the policy of non-interest. And the first point is that the politicians and the political parties fail to become engaged and form political but also social debate on some important issues. And then from the societal perspective or societal view, we actually end up with some kind of situation of a silent consensus. So the things are not really debated, there is not a real consensus, but basically no one criticizes the issue, so we tend to view them as well, we might even say as a national interest, or the things that are generally agreed upon, although it might not be the thing. And the other point that is interesting is that there are some important issues that very often have exogenous or external origin, and they very often became subjects of great political controversies, and basically we end up in a position where the parties dig in their very strong position, the consensus is impossible, and it also creates a situation in a society, a situation of a great controversy and basically split, and we can't really move from the situation. And I'd like to illustrate these 2 points rather theoretically on 2, I would say, major issues of Czech security policy. The first, quite obviously, would be a missile defense issue or the radar issue, if you want to. I would argue that the entire MD issue was originally created as a matter of the American national interest that was basically transposed to the position of the Governmental Speech Act that was basically later securitized, or rather immediately securitized and presented basically as a national interest. So in fact, if you look at the situation, we might see that the Czech government basically internalized and strongly securitized the external discourse, basically the American discourse on this. I would also say that it was actually a very fast process of securitization that basically skipped one of the phases that is usually understood in theoretical terms, or that is usually expected in theoretical terms. In this regard, is the phases of politicization that would be based on deliberative processes that are kind of typical for liberal democracies, and this actually moment would have tremendous consequences for the quality and level of the social debate and for the possibilities of the government. And now think about the PR the Czech government tried to do for the issue, to actually change the views of the society on the issues. One, I think, very illustrative moment and one kind of important issue in this regard was the creation of the special representative for the radar and his activities. And if you look at the beginning of his activities or his office activities, you will see that they basically translated and directly translated, and that was really the transposition of the discourse, translated American documents and basically used principally American strategic arguments. And again, I'm not talking from a normative position, I'm just saying that it was like a direct transposition of the American discourse, in fact, and it did not leave that much space for development of the kind of Czech strategic debate. And we've got a couple of Polish colleagues and friends here, and you might know that the situation in Poland was actually very different. So it's not anything that is automatic, and it seems to be interesting from a theoretical perspective. The last kind of note on the MD issue is that this formerly exogenous interest, or interest with the exogenous origin, was later multilateralized and as we call it, it went through the process of NATOization, excuse me. And it's very interesting to see where the NATOization actually started. It started with the condition of the smallest coalition party, the Green Party, that basically said that it would support the issue only if it will be strongly multilateral, strongly set in a multilateral framework, a NATO framework, and this is also very interesting, and it actually marked the situation where we are now, that the American national system is tied to the endeavors of the NATO in this regard, and it makes much more sense, in fact, strategically. But the beginning and then the diplomacy did actually a great job in this NATOization and multilateralization of the issue before the Bucharest summit. I mean, months before the Bucharest summit. So that would be a couple of thoughts on the MD issue. And now the other topic that is certainly important for our security policy, and it's the energy security, and it might be slightly surprising for you, but I would also say that if you trace the beginnings of the debate on energy security in the Czech Republic, you might actually come up to a conclusion that it again started with some kind of introduction of the American understanding of the energy security issue. You might trace this discursively as using, because in the debate you would find actually many kind of typical American geopolitical terms, for example, but there would be also other issues that might suggest that this happened. And this kind of American, I wouldn't call it interest in this way, but I would certainly call it American understanding of the issues, was very heavily and again immediately securitized by the Czech Atlanticist community. And if you think about people who are principal actors and principal promoters of the energy security issues, you would perhaps understand that those were very much people that would be usually understood as the promoters of the Atlanticist discourse. Why I think this is important for two particular reasons, and it's mostly the notions with which the energy security was immediately connected. And firstly, it was the notion of the construction of Russia as a threat. That is a typical Atlanticist basically idea or Atlanticist topic, and I would say that would be one of the burden in developing the notion of energy security further politically on the European level. And the second, it was the connection, and it's also very much connected to the construction of Russia as a threat. It was connected to the eastern dimension of our foreign policy, and again I would say it's rather more burdening than actually helping our Czech foreign policy. One, and again last note, one before last note on the energy security, is that the issue became really very, very important. If you look at the EU presidency priorities, and you still remember these triple E priorities, energy, economy, external relations, the energy security actually was presented in all of these three priorities. It's quite obviously presented in the energy issue. It was presented in the program in the economy part as a part of the idea of liberalization of the European energy market, and it was through the eastern dimension and through the eastern policies of the EU, certainly also presented in the part on external relations.
So that would be a couple of my theoretical notes, and I can see that I would receive the small papers, so I will basically skip those empirical and normative issues, but I would just very briefly in 30 seconds. I originally wanted to talk about the lacking and non-existing discourse on common security and defense policy, or the former ESDP, and I was going to say that we can't really expect much development from the political part, and it would be quite interesting to focus on the way in which economic sectors actually might boost and drive the development of the ESDP, and there might be actually some ways, and we can maybe get to this point in a discussion. And then I wanted to say something about the Czech army, and that the politicians actually should be a little bit more interested in what's going on in the armies. It might be acquisition policy that's interesting, and it might be the personal policies as well. You might remember that I think 5 generals resigned before the end of the year. But I mean, where's the real debate? And have you read that like heavily in the newspapers? Have you heard politicians talking about those people working on a top position within NATO and European Union? Thank you very much.
Superb. Thank you very much, Vít. And for our final paper, we turn to Ondřej Ditrych, who will speak to the Wonder Radar years, Czech foreign policy towards the United States between 2007 and 2009.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I would like to say first of all that the Czech foreign policy towards the United States was not dominated only by the perspective of the radar deployment, and in spite of the title of my short talk, I would like to say a few words about these other issues first, before I try to tackle the issue of the radar from a bit of a different perspective that Vítek has already done. So first of all, there has been human rights and what we call transition policy, and this has been something of a perennial in mutual relations towards third countries. Basically, it has had 2 dimensions, diplomatic and field, the first relating to support lent to the United States proposals in fora such as the United Nations, the second in channeling US funds to well-placed agencies linked in some capacity to the Czech MFA that do the job on the ground like people in need. The existing cooperation seems to have taken something of a downturn after Barack Obama's administration took power. Second, there was the issue of visas. The Czech Republic had long striven to remove the existing asymmetricity in visitor visa requirements. Particularly after the 9/11, the chances looked pretty bleak, but later on it was able to capitalize on its participation in war on terror, as it was, together with other CEE countries, awarded the Bush administration support in obtaining visa equality. And this was in 2006. It allied with those countries in what was called a coalition for visa equality to effectively lobby the Congress. And when the legislation passed, quite favorable to Czech Republic, less favorable to some other coalition members, after an initial show of solidarity, it went on to sign the memorandum alone. I think if we look at some sort of positive achievements of Czech foreign policy towards the United States in the last few years, this conclusion of this visa chapter would probably be the most significant tangible outcome. I'd say that the co-development agreement on participation of public and private entities in development of US military technology, which was obviously linked to the radar negotiations, was also very important, with far-reaching significance. But I think, if I understand it, there are some issues to be resolved, as the entire missile defense project has taken a bit of a different turn. The obvious failure, I think, was the inability of the Czech government to sell its missile defense policy, of what Vítek framed as the failure of the Securitization Act, or the Securitization Act. Now, I will go very briefly over the radar negotiations milestones. To reiterate, to refresh your memory perhaps, the first consultations were held already in 2002, but it took 5 years before the formal negotiations were initiated. The US non-paper, including the request, was received at the MFA, this building, reportedly only hours after the Topolánek government was invested by the parliament in January 2007. Two agreements were concluded in mid-2008, the so-called Main Treaty and a Status of Forces Agreement. The government's position in the parliament becoming ever more fragile and the issue inflaming a considerable controversy, they never made it. They never made the ratification by the lower chamber. And in fact, they were withdrawn from the agenda in March 2009, a week before Topolánek's government was brought down in a vote of non-confidence. In September last year, President Obama announced that the missile defense system would undergo a review, and later in the fall, negotiations started on how Czech Republic could possibly participate. And this is basically where we stand now. Before, the radar spurred a considerable public and political controversy, and in fact, this yet imaginary ball seemed like a magnet for various kind of haphazard geopolitical visions of Czech national future, which featured not only the United States, but also Russia, NATO, and the EU. And I would say that such debate on spatial location and orientation of Czech Republic in world politics, on whence lied the threats and how they should be countered, would of course be only welcome if this debate, or what sort of appeared as a debate, were not marked by what I would call a certain degree of provincialism that manifested itself primarily in myopia and I would say even narcissism, leading first to inflating Czech Republic's and CEE's importance in US global policy, and second, misreading US interests, particularly after the new administration came and struck a new balance between utopia and reality. And now, in my personal opinion, it's in spite of some opinions that were furthered in this respect, I would say that I would say basically three things. But President Obama's decision to change the missile defense design had very little to do with the political debate in the Czech Republic and much more to do with the administration's view of how great power politics should be handled, and also of consideration, for instance, of its Middle East partnerships. Then second, Central Europe was not really left to be preyed upon by Russia. In regard to this, I would say that there seemed to be sort of a constant rhetorical confusion among the radar proponents, whether the radar would sort of enhance Czech security against these new pirates of the world order, terrorists and rogue states, or the revolutionary power in the East. Third and last, Czech Republic never had any special relationship with the US, because in my opinion, such idea is simply impossible. Great powers do not have special relationships with small states. On the other hand, Czech Republic remains firmly anchored in the transatlantic security architecture, though a serious debate on Czech priorities in the new strategic concept still remains something to be wished for, and it's probably too late for it anyway. In conclusion, I would like to suggest that we may be better off if we forget about the radar, and this is not really policy advice. If it were, it would come too late anyway. What I suggest is instead that we forget not about radar as any real world structure, but rather about the ways in which it has been endowed with meaning, either as an encroachment of Czech national sovereignty or a protective shield to Czech Kremlin's imperialist ambition, for instance, and thought patterns that made those ideas, both of which are, quite unfortunately, very real, possible. And only then we can have a realistic debate on foreign policy. Thank you.
Excellent again. Thank you very much. Before we open to a general discussion, I have the tremendous challenge of offering some opening remarks on 6 extremely interesting, very, very deeply informed papers. And indeed, it's people on this table that I have turned to for information for their work over many years. So this is a tremendous challenge to do. But if I could present perhaps some questions that seem to me to arise from the totality of what we've heard here. First, the question of what is foreign policy? I mean, in the most strict terms, we tend to think of foreign policy as the outputs, the ends of a process. But by and large here, I think we're not thinking foreign policy that way. And I think that's very healthy. That's very constructive. That leads us to a second question, and that is, where does foreign policy come from? And I think in each of the papers, we've seen very clear indications of multiplicities of actors in almost every policy realm within Czech foreign policy. And at times, these have been very, very different actors. Some of the papers have very rightly showed how outside influence has been the instigator. Missile defense, aspects of the EU. We've also heard about questions of origins, coordination of policy between and among governmental ministries. And I think that was particularly true in Jan's case when, and think again of the broadening of foreign policy when we think about trade, economic relations as part of foreign policy. In many of the papers, particularly the earlier papers, there was a lot of attention given to the considerations of political parties, to society more generally. And indeed, while I won't ask specific questions of each paper, there are certain points that I might take the liberty of raising. And on our paper, for example, on the Balkans, I'd like to know more of the societal impulses on Balkan questions. Why, for example, if there was popular unhappiness with the Kosovan recognition issue, that didn't continue. How societal concerns are, or perhaps are not, mobilized, and how they are brought in or not into the policy process. There are questions then of being reactive to policy, but there are also matters here where the Czech Republic is an obvious initiator of policy. And I thought what was particularly intriguing on our recap in both German relations and on the EU was the ways in which the Czech Republic, if you want, confronted with a bigger player in the case of Germany, in the case of the EU, a very large multilateral institution, could have roles to play. In fact, be a starter of certain processes, not simply a consumer of those. And I think that's very, very encouraging and something that we should probably give more attention to. History came up, inevitably, but it came up in very different ways and in very different contexts. I was certainly struck in the early 1990s, and I think somebody like Vladimír Handl in particular knows this in tremendous depth, about the fears, naturally, of Germany, and particularly, not only, but particularly on the economic front. I remember in the mainstream newspapers, political cartoons showing the then German Chancellor driving a big Mercedes over Czechoslovakia, cartoons of Czechoslovakia as Czechoslovakia zimmerfrei, Czechoslovakia, it's room-free, it's available to the Germans. We all know, of course, that the initial foreign investment was overwhelmingly German, and the depth of concern that came with that. And I think the then Czechoslovak and then Czech leaderships were very effective in turning that issue around to encourage other foreign investment. And now we've come, as we heard in Jan's paper, to a situation where there doesn't seem to be any particular political concerns about foreign direct investment in the country, and indeed no need for governmental support for it. We have very, very substantial changes in the economic dimension. History then is perhaps not an actor anymore, although I was interested to hear how Vladimír mentioned that it is featuring in very specific dimensions, and that's 13 odd years after the treaty was signed, and that was a very, very difficult treaty, I think, to achieve. Other aspects of history, though, the interpretation of the Balkans. Croatia referenced the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a source of familiarity, perhaps more than that, and kinds of even, dare we use the word, even cultural differences. I hesitate to say dividing lines, but the history features there. We heard in Vít Beneš's paper the language of big beasts, the great powers, trauma, in the beautiful multilateral forum of the European Union. So history is there, but in very, very different ways. And perhaps the key players we might expect, I mean, the dilemma, the great German dilemma, is perhaps the most settled of that. So I think there are a great number of questions for us to think of. This was a roundtable. It brought forth, I think, what people think are some of the key issues. It's not meant to be completely comprehensive, but perhaps we didn't specifically talk about, and I'll end off on these points, we didn't specifically talk about humanitarianism in foreign policy. I mean, there was mention of, say, people in need, the NGO, those kinds of activities. Democracy promotion appeared a little bit, but it appeared, I think, particularly in US-Czech relations, rather than in terms of the EU. Relatively little, I think, on the Eastern Partnership. It was mentioned, but it wasn't, I think, a major feature of our discussions. The question of overseas military presences, yes, NATO, of course, featured, but the specific questions of deployments, the Afghan-type questions, and indeed energy security. But as we know, we had quite a lot of contribution on that yesterday. So shall we open up to the floor? And indeed, we'll come back to all of our speakers as well. If you could indicate your intention to speak using the microphone, and if you could introduce yourselves first, please. Thank you.
Probably you know me. I have been here since the first day. My name is Sobotka. I have one question to Mr. Střítecký and one question to Mr. Hřích. Mr. Střítecký, are you aware that in case of existence of military base of USA on the territory of the Czech Republic, the other part in armed conflict, I mean the country invaded by USA, has a legal right to attack the US installation on the territory of the Czech Republic? I repeat, legal right to attack. It does not, the international law does not decide what kind of means should be used. That means any use can be, any mean can be used. I think that it is of some kind of threat to the security of the Czech Republic. The question to Mr. Hřích. On the first day, practically all political parties agreed that this country should do economic diplomacy. It's a tremendous achievement as far as consensus among the parliamentary countries is concerned. But only one representative of one political party mentioned one step which should be due to implement, to increase budget of this ministry. I think that economic relations is an important instrument of the foreign policy of any country. But are you aware that there are restrictions for foreign trade from this countryside to the foreign trade and economic relations? Why? Why should be restrictions to foreign trade with China, for instance? China is not dependent on the Czech Republic, but we are. Why should we have restrictions? Why should be foreign trade and foreign economic cooperation be done by the Ministry of Industry and not by this ministry?
Professor Sobotka, thank you very much. There was another question, if we could take it now. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Filip Tesař. I'm a former ambassador of the Czech Republic to Kinshasa, DRC. Okay, one question to Mr. Hřích. What about the your model about triangle? Isn't it Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Trade, and the economic departments of the embassies, of the Czech embassies? Have you some information about the position of the other countries of the European Union? Is that model normal, or I don't know, because of the experience in the praxis are not the best, I think, here. Okay, it was one question. the other question to you, what do you mean about the cooperation, international cooperation of the Czech Republic? What the case of our initiative in the third world countries, namely in Africa. Is it possible to use, for example, or what about your experience with the 10th European Development Fund? And one question to Mr. Střítecký. Okay, you have also spoken about the energetical security. What do you mean about the typical Czech model? I have had repeatedly the many information about the model with the application of oil and gas, but what about the alternative sources? What about the solar energy, geothermal energy, energy of nuclear fusion, etc.? Do you have some parameters of the Czech position? Not only the copy of the grade. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a third question, please.
Hello, my name is Marcin Telikowski. I'm an analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and I deal mainly with security issues. And I have two questions, one to Mr. Střítecký and the other one to Mr. Ditrych. Maybe I'll start with the question to Mr. Ditrych. Well, I'll try to be quite specific. How do you assess the possibility of desecuritizing relations of the Czech Republic with the US after the change of the concept of the BMD, which has been presented by the Obama administration autumn last year? And do you see any other areas of potential to cooperate between the states? I don't know, maybe the economic relations. Is there any reflection going on this, or just after the change of the concept of the BMD, it seems that maybe the relations will simply decrease in both in the scope and the intensity? And I have also two questions to Mr. Střítecký, and they refer maybe to the part which you mentioned that you were eager to say, but they are quite closely related to what I deal with in my research. Concerning the CSDP, the involvement of the Czech Republic into the battle group concept, do you see that there is any possibility to maybe engage Czech Republic in a discussion on the future of the battle groups, given the fact that there will be soon a battle group constructed by Czech Republic with Germany and other partners, and then there is the planned so-called V4 battle group, also with participation of Polish, Slovak and Hungarian troops. And do you see any possibility to maybe use this opportunity to promote any new approach to the conception of the battle groups? Because we know that the debate has been started by Swedish presidency, but it hasn't so far led to anything constructive. And the second question I would like to remain in the regional dimension of security, the V4 and the military R&D, the EDA projects. Do you see that? Do you think that are there any possibilities to use the existing relations, good relations, and existing mechanism of V4 and regional cooperations to give the industry and the research cells, research institutes, the military and technical research institutes, the ability to cooperate, to enter EDA programs, or to acquire EDA funds for research, because such a cooperation, in the light of the very strict cooperation of, I would say, the biggest and Western European defense industry, would be something extremely valuable for this region. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a wealth of questions there. They seem to cluster towards the ends of our panelists, but not exclusively. Can I suggest, Jan, if you'd like to offer the first responses, we can move along and see if any of our panelists then want to come in, and then we can get down to Vít, who also has a number of questions waiting for him. And yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, what should I say? Yes, to Mr. Sobotka, the Czech Republic is a part not only of WTO, but in the first line of European Union. And European Union is an area, among other, with common external commercial policy. Yes, and I think no special barriers for trade with China. I don't know about something like this or restrictions. Of course, we are a part of problem of balance of some countries, of Western countries with China. Yes, is unbalanced, of course, and there are many reasons for it. But I think the Czech economic diplomacy is relatively successful on China market, and some successes we can speak about. Yes, it is of course a problem, China, which is mentioned sometimes, but I don't think that it would be so much influenced by politics, by political meetings and political actions. I think China is very pragmatic in economic respect. Yes, the question of competencies, yes, it is, of course, and yes, it is very near to Mr. Jansky's question. Yes, there are some models, a few models of steering of economic diplomacy, or as I say, the support of external economic relations. I think the model of the Czech Republic is one of possible models. Yes, of course, in some countries there is, for instance, one strong economic ministry which makes its own foreign economic policy. Yes, in other countries there are the competencies within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, yes, or some special ministry for external economic relations, something like the former the Czechoslovak Federal Ministry of External Trade. Yes, of course there is a problem, a broader problem. On the one hand, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which have competencies and capacities to make foreign policy as such. On the other hand, the Economic Ministry, which has competencies, capabilities, yes, to make economic policy, to set agenda of economic policy, yes, and we can, it is not so easy to discriminate economic policy, internal and external sense. Yes, of course, it is a possibility to concentrate the capabilities for external economic policy within, for instance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it makes a problem, yes, the relations of external economic policy and internal economic policy, yes, and it is to be coordinated as well in some other manner. My personal opinion is that our today's model is more or less acceptable. There is no challenge to change it in a principle way, but there are some other opinions as well, I know. Yes, and regarding developmental questions, Africa and so on, I am afraid I am not the right person that should it answer. Yes, it is other topic, yes, from our point of view, development questions, and this, yes, I have to apologize. I wouldn't like to answer this question. I could say only very general meanings. Yes, it would be all.
Thank you very much. Ondřej, there was a specific question to you among those questions.
Yes, it is a question on the future of Czech and US relations. What I tried to say in my brief talk was that I did not think there was a sea change after Obama's administration to review the missile defense project, and not a sea change in terms of Czech position, so security, guarantees and such. And I think this applies pretty much also for the US-Czech relations as well. I think the human rights agenda is still very much present, though, as I said, there was a little bit of a downturn, and there has been some resentment on the Czech part about this sort of new pragmatism of Obama administration, but the area is still very much alive and the cooperation is very much alive. I would say there might be something of a downgrade observed in the area of security, and it actually did not start with the September announcement, but it sort of could have been expected really that it was coming. The missile defense project obviously is not dead, but it's sort of hibernated, and it's obviously not a policy priority for the Obama administration right now, as it not in any way close to what it was before. So hence the reason for my prediction. There is something that one thing that I did not mention was a strategic dialogue that the Czech Republic and the US commenced as part of sort of the radar negotiations, and this strategic dialogue has a sort of event or appearance of exclusivity, because the US have this strategic dialogue only with a few countries in the world, but I think there's not really any sort of tangible much of a tangible outcome to be expected from this. So I think there is not likely to be sort of a significant downturn in relations or downgrade in relations witnessed, and this is a short answer to your question.
Thank you indeed. Not that they're obliged to, but I wonder if, for example, Filip or Vladimír would like to come in on anything at this stage. You don't need to. Vít Beneš, if you'd like to, then go ahead. And then we'll end with Vít.
I would like to react to your comments and questions. Very much, I would like to thank you for the appraisal of history. I think history is very important here, or to be more precise, the interpretation of history very much influences the daily politics of the Czech Republic, the daily foreign policy of the Czech Republic, especially vis-à-vis the European Union. I would say that we usually tend to overestimate the role of individuals and the role of political parties, but we should not forget that the individuals, I don't know, like President Václav Klaus or the political parties, are only vehicles of the interpretations of history, of traumas, of fears, of hopes, and we could clearly see these things in the Czech policy towards the European Union. Historically, the Czech nation tends to balance between two positions. We tend to accept the influence from the outside world, like from the West. On the other side, we tend to position ourselves into the teachers or the priests, the preachers. You can clearly see it in. I'm going really back to the deep history. In the Hussite movement, we somehow, accepted the influence, but we change it a bit and throw it back again. So we became Christians, but we tried to reform the outside world. So we were very much preaching to the outside world, to Europe. And this is actually what we see right now, or what we saw the Czech Republic, even though there is the ordinary people are not very much interested in Europe and European Union, we have elites who refuse to be just the students of Europe, and they try to act as teachers. These elites are very much convinced of what is right and what is wrong and what Europe did wrong. And they try to teach Europe some kind of unique Czech experience, I don't know, with economic transformation, with Russia, or with human rights. But in fact, these people are turning to be preachers. Probably the problem is that they are preachers without authority, preachers who who are not backed by the domestic consensus, but these are different questions. So I would like to stress that the interpretation of history matters, and that the historical role which the Czech nation historically tried to play somehow bubbles up in our approach towards the European Union.
Okay, thank you indeed for all your questions. I hope I won't forget any, because there are a couple of. But first, about the kind of legalistic perspective on the radar idea. Well, I'm not sure what kind of interpretation, legal interpretation, or what kind of act are you really referring to? But I would actually generally argue that, and I tend to actually view the legalistic perspective as rather unusual in this case. It's much more important in what kind of alliances are. In what kind of alliances are we members, and what kind of basically means can we use within these alliances. So I think it's much more important that we are part of NATO and we are part of the developing European project, and I think it's a much more important issue than the legalistic perspective. So I would tend to see it as a actually great deterrent moment for anyone who would like to attack the Czech territory, and no matter if there is a radar or not. And that comes back to the debate that unfortunately I would find actually quite unuseful as well, and that is if a radar would enhance or undermine the Czech security. Well, I simply don't know. We might find a couple of arguments on both sides, obviously, but again, I would rather turn to different topics and to like more strategic topics. Like interesting issues for me is the relation of the missile defense to the deterrent theory and to the entire deterrent and global deterrent situation, and also regional deterrent situation, that I would find actually really useful. And then also the relation of the MD issue to the arms control, that is getting to be a big topic, and it's something what hasn't been discussed here, and it's kind of, we still remain silent on this. And so I would rather go basically these ways, and I find these debates, strategic debates, more useful than debates on enhancing on or undermining the security situation, or some kind of legalistic perspective on the issue. On the energy security, I strongly agree with you, and if I would like to be provocative here, I would basically say that in this country, and it's like my personal feeling, the discussion on energy are in 95% of cases basically done by security experts or people from the security community, and only by, let's say, 5% by people working on energy issues in a more like sort of technical sense. And I'm deeply convinced that it should be vice versa. And I'd like to see much more of the discussions on this kind of technical part of it, and much less on the security part. And that's that kind of burden I've tried to suggest it here, and the kind of result of the great securitization. And I would like to see less Russia and less Eastern policies in the energy agenda, and much more discussion on, and much more agenda on alternative resources, as you mentioned. And there wouldn't be a certainly an issue for me. That would be issue for other kind of experts or technical experts. So I strongly agree in this case. And then the questions on the common security and defense policy and the future of the battle group concept. Well, I would have one kind of general response on that. We're going to have a panel here on American foreign policy and its reflections in Central Europe in a moment. And I think it's becoming still more and more obvious that although I've never understood the European project as some kind of competition for the NATO project. Now I think they are strongly complementary, or in other words, or put it differently, I would argue that if you want a strong transatlantic link, we need to strengthen the Europe first to become a real strategic partner. Then we can talk again with the Americans if you want to build like a better and stronger relation. I'm not entirely sure if the battle group concept might be something what should be developed. It's a slightly different discussion. On the other hand, it is still an opportunity to promote the agenda of common security and defense policy. And I know there will be the Polish presidency. It's one of the big priorities. And I think the diplomacy is certainly prepared to discuss these issues. And I still hope that the defense communities or Ministry of Defense will be still more and more prepared actually to discuss these things, and there might be some dynamics, and the view that only NATO is the relevant security actor might be changing, but it's getting slowly. So we'll see. I wish it was so actually. And then the possible cooperation on the sort of EDA projects within DV4. I think it's a great opportunity. And it's something, again, and that's why I sort of try to raise that issue, we are not really discussing and we are not really working on. It would be quite interesting to see how many people in this building work on the CSDP and particularly have some kind of contacts with the European Defense Agency. I'm not certain, but there would be a few. And it's even more sad that perhaps there will be only a few of people dealing with this agenda on the Ministry of Defense as well. So, and there would be like a principal actor perhaps in that, and not to mention Ministry of Trade and Development. So we need to perhaps really work on that, and then I would see it as a great chance actually to start again within the Central European framework, because that's very close. On the other hand, there are many national obstacles as well. I mean, we've got very, very bad legal framework for that. Might be different problems in Poland, but that would be for a different discussion. So I'll stop here.
Okay, Vít, thank you very much. We are coming towards the end of our session. We could have the opportunity for one final brief question if there is, but if not, I certainly know that a couple of our panelists would still like to make some concluding comments. So, going? All right, then Jan, if you would very briefly, please.
Jan Ružička, Department of International Politics, University of Wales, Aberystwyth. I wonder, several speakers called for a real debate, and at the same time you bemoaned the lack of consensus. So I wonder if you want to have it both ways.
Okay, thank you for that. Panelists who would like to make a final and brief comment may also address the question from Jan. Those who'd like to speak? Vladimír?
Thank you. To your comment, Rick, and perhaps to some extent to Jan's comment as well, yes, we don't have really any political actors who would have the ambition to define Czech foreign policy in long term. So there is no discourse within the political parties, there is no public discourse, and that's something what we have highlighted the first day of this conference also with the representatives of the political parties. At the same time, what I think we can witness is a gradual socialization of the political parties and of the governmental institutions into European policy making, into the policy making with the multilateral institutions, both EU and NATO. And there, I think, is the chance for more coherent and perhaps some broader social backing and political backing of Czech foreign policy. At the moment, we don't have this effect yet, but I'm hopeful there. Also, through this socialization, we've seen the Europeanization of some political actors, like the Civic Democratic Party, ODS. I think then, not by design, turned the ODS into a proactive European actor, but by default, by doing things, by chairing the European presidency, preparing for it. So I think this is again a dynamic which is hopeful. At the same time, on more critical note, I have to say, yes, we see with this multiple political actors, with the decentralization of policy processes and foreign policy process, we see a danger of a fragmentation of Czech foreign policy making. And one of the examples of it is obviously that we don't have a foreign policy concept since 2006. There was a hope that after the Czech presidency there will be new debate about foreign policy concept. We don't have it yet. We don't have a concept of relations with Germany, obviously, and we don't have really very effective way of coordinating foreign policies. So we have very number of institutional and political actors who really run their own agendas in foreign policy area, but we don't have really effective coordination, and that may turn into a problem if we don't deal with this. Thank you.
Of our other panelists, a final note? All right. Please, Filip, go ahead.
Only a few words on the issue of history in political relationship. History, I'm sure, can be or can offer a strong basis for a close relationship. In the past, there are virtually no conflicts or confrontations between Czechs and Balkan nations or states. And Czechs and Czechia are quite popular in the Balkans. So Czechia could be a good trademark in the Balkans. But Czech politicians use mainly only a very, very fuzzy historical images of the Balkan history, or images of the Czech relations to the Balkans. And they mix these fuzzy images with very, very superficial images taken from the Czech news. And this, according to me, clearly indicates the lack of the will in the development of the relationships with the Balkan countries, at least with some of them.
All right, well, it comes to me now to thank all of our panelists, and indeed all of you, for making what at least I think was an extremely interesting and informative session. Before we do formally conclude, I'm going to call on Dr. Korjan to take on the next round of proceedings. But if we could offer thanks in the usual way. Thank you indeed.